Have you ever noticed how heavy a thought can be? It weighs nothing on a scale, yet it can feel like you are carrying a mountain on your shoulders. It keeps you awake. It keeps you tight. It keeps you from the peace you deserve. I'm glad you're here. If you are listening to this, it's likely that your day has been long, or your mind is busy. Perhaps you are replaying conversations, worrying about tomorrow, or simply feeling a tension you can't quite name. That is okay. You don't need to force it to stop. And if you feel like it, you can gently let me know in the comments where you're listening from tonight. Sometimes, it's comforting to realize how many of us are quietly sharing this same moment from different corners of the world. You see, the mind is like a guardian dog. It barks at shadows because it wants to protect you. We don't need to yell at the dog to be quiet. We just need to gently let it know that we are safe, so it can lay its head down and rest. For the next hour, I am going to share a collection of stories with you. These aren't just fairy tales. They are mirrors. Some are from the Zen tradition, some from Stoic philosophy, and some are simple metaphors for the human experience. Each story revolves around two things: the art of letting go and the discovery of your inner strength. You don't need to memorize these stories. You don't even need to listen to every word. If you drift off to sleep in the middle of a sentence, that is perfect. That is the goal. Think of my voice as a gentle breeze. You can enjoy it while it's there, but you don't need to hold on to it. Get comfortable now. Adjust your pillows. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Unclench your jaw. Let's begin with our first journey, a journey about the weight we choose to carry. Some fears don't scream. They stand still, hidden behind a door that's only slightly closed. And because they stay there so long, they begin to grow inside the imagination. Chloe got back to her room late that night. Her shift at the store had run longer than expected. Her feet ached. Her mind felt empty in a familiar way. The bedroom was small. A soft yellow desk lamp gave just enough light to move around without tripping, but not enough to make everything feel fully clear. She set her bag down on the chair, slipped off her shoes, and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Not because anything was wrong, just because her body wasn't ready to stand again yet. In the quiet room, there was a very soft sound, the steady hum of the air conditioner repeating like a background rhythm. Chloe was 22, working in retail, used to smiling, responding, reacting quickly. But when she was alone, that reflex wasn't needed. And when nothing needed her reaction anymore, the things she'd pushed aside all day began to show themselves. Her eyes drifted to the closet. The wooden door was closed. Nothing unusual about it. And yet, there was a faint, almost shapeless feeling that something inside hadn't been touched. Not in a horror movie way. Just a pocket of darkness holding thoughts she wasn't quite ready to face. Chloe stood up and walked toward the closet. Her hand rested on the handle, then stopped. Not because of clear fear, just a familiar hesitation. Like knowing there's an unread message, but not opening it yet, not because of what it says, but because of what it might stir up. Some fears grow precisely because we avoid them. Each time we don't open the door, the mind adds another detail. Another possibility, another imagined outcome. And before long, the door stops being just a door. It becomes a symbol for everything we haven't dared to look at. Chloe let go of the handle and turned back to the bed. She sat down, pulled the blanket up slightly, then let it fall back again. She wasn't trying to sleep yet. Being close to the bed just made her feel safer. In her mind, familiar thoughts began to run quietly. What if I'm not good enough? What if I choose the wrong path? What if everyone else moves forward and I stay stuck? They didn't make noise, but they were clear enough to tighten her chest just a little. She closed her eyes for a few seconds, then opened them. The desk lamp looked the same. Nothing had changed. And in that moment, Chloe realized what was exhausting her wasn't the lack of answers, it was leaving the questions in the dark. She stood up again. This time she moved more slowly. Her hand returned to the closet handle. Cool, ordinary. No sign of danger, just wood, metal, and her own room. Chloe pulled the closet door open just a crack. Not all the way, just enough for a line of light to slip inside. Hanging clothes came into view, a few jackets, plastic hangers tapping softly against each other. No ghost, just familiar things quietly waiting to be seen. She opened it a little more. The light spread. The inside of the closet became clearer. And at the same time, a strange feeling appeared: lightness. Not because anything had been solved, but because there was no longer a need to imagine. Some fears don't need to be defeated. They only need to be seen. When light touches them, they shrink not from shame, but because their job is finished. Chloe let out a breath, longer than usual. Her shoulders dropped. She realized she'd been holding tension for a long time without noticing. Not because of the closet, but because of the thoughts that had been standing there unopened for too long. She opened the closet door all the way, looked inside without rushing, just looked. No analysis, no labels. There were clothes she hadn't worn in a long time, items that belonged to earlier chapters of her life. Nothing frightening, just time having passed. Chloe closed the closet door again. This time the motion was softer. Not closing it to avoid something, but closing it after having looked. She went back to the bed and lay down. The air conditioner continued its steady hum. The ceiling was still. But inside her, a small space had opened. Not an empty space of lack, but a space created by no longer having to brace herself against avoidance. Maybe fear isn't most frightening when it's in front of us. Maybe it's most frightening when we leave it behind a door and let imagination do the rest. After closing the closet door, Chloe didn't turn on any more lights. She let the room stay exactly as it was, bright enough to see dim, enough not to demand attention. There was a subtle shift in the air, hard to name, as if the room had just exhaled after holding its breath for too long. She lay on her side and pulled the blanket up to her shoulders, not curling in on herself like she often did, not shrinking, just lying there, letting her back sink into the mattress, letting her weight be held by something other than herself. The air conditioner continued its steady hum, a familiar background sound that didn't need listening to. The thoughts were still there, but they weren't pressed right up against the edge of her awareness anymore. They had stepped back a little, like when you turn on a light in a dark room. The objects don't disappear. They just stop crowding each other. Chloe thought about the moment her hand had rested on the closet handle. That brief hesitation. Not exactly fear, but uncertainty about whether she was ready to look. And then after she had looked, she realized the hardest part hadn't been what was inside, but carrying it around without knowing its shape. Some fears survive on vagueness. They don't need to be big. They only need to stay unseen. And once light is present, they don't have much work left to do. Chloe rolled onto her back. The ceiling was faint in the lamplight. She let her eyes rest on an indistinct spot, not trying to focus. Her breathing was even. Not deep, not shallow, just even. A quiet understanding settled in. She didn't need to solve every question the moment she saw it. Seeing was enough for tonight. No answers required. No plans needed. Just knowing they weren't ghosts. In the stillness of the room, nothing was asking anything of her. No one waiting for a response. Nothing to prove. Chloe wasn't a better version of herself than she had been earlier. She was just a version that was avoiding a little less. And that didn't feel exhausting. A soft click came from the air conditioner as it shifted cycles. Chloe closed her eyes, not to fall asleep yet, just to stop looking. A gentle warmth spread from her chest, not happiness, not sadness, just the feeling of being allowed to be still. If the questions returned tomorrow, they would return. There was no promise they would disappear. But now Chloe knew she could open the door when she needed to. And knowing that was enough to make the darkness less frightening for now. She placed one hand on her belly and felt the rise and fall of her breath. No need to control it. No need to track it. Just noticing. Some nights don't require great courage. They only ask for one small act to look and then allow yourself to rest afterward. Not resting because you've defeated fear, but resting because you're no longer running. The room slowly settled into a deeper quiet. The background hum steady. The light unchanged. Chloe didn't need to change anything else. The night held the rest for her. Some fears don't come from things standing still, but from the feeling that everything is moving too fast. Like water rising quietly. No noise, no warning, until you suddenly realize you've been trying to swim against the current. Marcus left work after it was fully dark. He drove his familiar delivery truck into the automatic car wash near his place, where bright white lights reflected off wet metal. That night, he wasn't in a hurry. Not because he had extra time, but because his body felt tired in a way that was hard to name, tired from gripping the steering wheel for too long. Marcus was 41, a delivery driver, used to packed schedules, used to being on time, en route, on rhythm. But tonight, as the truck rolled to the start of the wash track, he let his hands drop from the wheel and allowed the vehicle to move forward on its own. A very small thing, very ordinary, and somehow unfamiliar. The doors closed. Water began to pour over the windshield, loud at first, then settling into a steady rush. The sound of the water covered everything else, blurring the outside world. Marcus sat still, watching droplets race across the glass, merging and separating, never moving in straight lines. Inside the cab, everything felt quieter. No radio, no alerts. Just the sound of water and the gentle vibration as the conveyor pulled the truck along. Marcus noticed he was holding his breath, an old habit whenever he waited for something uncertain. He breathed out, letting his chest fall, then breathed in again slower. A memory surfaced of swimming in a river when he was a kid. The adults had warned him, if the current is strong, don't fight it. Let your body float. Let the water carry you toward a safer edge. Back then, Marcus didn't understand. Swimming against it felt like trying. Letting go sounded like giving up. But later, he learned that in fast-moving water, struggling in the wrong direction is what puts you in danger. The water kept pouring down. Soft brushes spun and brushed against the sides of the truck, then moved on. Marcus noticed his hands resting on his thighs. His fingers were slightly curled, as if ready to grip again at any moment. He opened his hand just a little, not letting go completely, just easing the tension. Marcus's fear didn't have a clear shape. It wasn't one specific event. It was the sense that if he stopped controlling things for even a second, everything would slip off course. That if he didn't stay tight, didn't keep holding it together, life would carry him somewhere he hadn't planned to go. But right now, in a vehicle that wasn't steering yet, was still moving, Marcus noticed something else. The truck didn't need him to guide it through the wash. The conveyor knew its job. The water knew its path, and he only needed to sit. A stronger wave of water swept across the windshield, turning the outside into shifting light and shadow. Marcus didn't try to see through it. He let his eyes rest. A small sensation appeared, not full relief, just a little less strain. Like the moment you stop fighting the current and realize you're not sinking right away. He thought about the past few months, all the effort to keep things organized, the pressure of keeping everyone else steady. The nights he came home with his shoulders still tight. Maybe life hadn't been too harsh. Maybe he'd just been swimming upstream for too long. The water began to soften. The final droplets fell more slowly. The conveyor kept moving the truck forward, steady and patient. Marcus realized his breathing had deepened without him noticing. Not the kind of deep breath you forced to relax, just a breath that wasn't being held anymore. The truck was almost out of the wash. The lights ahead became clearer. Marcus placed his hands back on the steering wheel, feeling the familiar surface. This time he didn't grip it. He just rested his hands there, ready to guide when needed. Maybe letting go isn't about allowing the water to pull you under. Maybe it's about knowing when to swim and when to let the water hold you up. And tonight, in this brief moment, Marcus was being held. The truck rolled out of the car wash and paused briefly before the conveyor released Marcus back onto the road. He stayed seated for a few seconds, not because there was something to do, but because his body wasn't ready to rush. The windshield was still dotted with water, turning the streetlights into soft, blurred halos. The world outside wasn't sharp, and this time he didn't try to make it clearer. Marcus turned on the wipers, a slow rhythm. Each pass cleared part of the glass, then the view softened again as new droplets settled. There was no moment of perfect clarity, but there was no moment of total blindness either. He noticed he didn't need to choose between the two. He pulled onto the road, driving more slowly than usual. Not because he was tired, but because there was no reason to push himself forward. The traffic light ahead shifted from green to yellow, then red. Marcus stopped, planted both feet firmly on the floor. His hands stayed on the wheel, but the pressure was different. There was no urge to grip. Something became clearer to him swimming against the current. Doesn't just exhaust the body, it blurs your sense of direction. When all your energy goes into resistance, you stop hearing the signals of the water. You only hear your heartbeat and your rushed breathing. And in that state, it's hard to tell where the shore is. Marcus watched the thin line of cars ahead. The city at night wasn't as loud as it was during the day. It moved more slowly with its own rhythm. He noticed small details he usually overlooked. Light spilling onto tree branches, a closed storefront, a sign gently swaying in the breeze. Things that were there every night, but only appeared when he stopped rushing. Fear hadn't disappeared. It didn't need to. It just wasn't driving anymore. It sat somewhere else in the truck, quieter, no longer giving commands. Marcus realized he could live alongside this uncertainty, as long as he didn't try to shove it away or pull it too close. He remembered that moment in the river years ago when he stopped fighting the current and let the water lift him. It hadn't felt completely safe, but it was the first moment he wasn't exhausted. And only when he wasn't exhausted could he see where to go. The truck turned into his familiar neighborhood. The roads narrowed. The streetlights softened to yellow. Marcus slowed down, as if naturally matching the pace of the space around him. He parked in front of his house, turned off the engine, and stayed seated. An old habit would have told him to get out right away and finish whatever was next. But tonight, there was no list waiting. He rested his head against the seat and closed his eyes for a moment. Not long. Just long enough to feel his body being held by the seat, by the ground beneath, by the simple fact that right now he was safe. Inhale, exhale. No counting, no goal. Marcus opened his eyes and stepped out of the truck. The night air was cool. He closed the door gently. Every movement was a little slower, not on purpose, but because he was no longer being pulled by hurried thoughts. Maybe tomorrow the current would be strong again. Work responsibility and the things he couldn't control would return. But tonight he remembered something important: you don't always have to swim. Sometimes the wisest choice is to float and trust the water to carry you through. Marcus went inside. Fewer lights on, the space quiet. He didn't carry the feeling of bracing himself anymore. Only a soft looseness in his shoulders and back, a sign that he'd stopped pushing. The night didn't ask him to fight the current. It simply invited him to rest and let the flow do the rest. Morning arrived very early for May. While the city was still asleep, while the streets were quiet and empty, the small kitchen behind her bakery was already lit. Soft white light fell onto the stainless steel counter, reflecting off fine traces of flour left from the day before. The space was calm, filled only with the steady hum of the ventilation fan, like a background breath. May was 37, the owner of a small bakery, used to beginning her days in silence. She washed her hands, dried them, then opened a large bag of flour. As the flour poured into the bowl, a thin white cloud rose and settled almost immediately. She added warm water, yeast, salt. Familiar movements requiring very little thought. There are seasons in life that feel like being underground. No visible progress, no sign of light. Just the sense of being buried, covered over, as if all the effort you've made has disappeared. May was in a season like that. Not because the bakery was failing, not because of any major crisis, just because things had stayed still longer than she'd hoped. She placed her hands into the bowl and began to knead. The dough clung to her palms, soft and warm. With each fold, push and turn, the dough changed shape very slowly. There was no immediate result, only the patient repetition of the same motion. In May's mind, familiar thoughts drifted through. What if I chose the wrong place? What if all this effort is only burying more time? What if I'm in the dark, not to grow, but to disappear? The questions weren't loud. They arrived steadily like the fan overhead. May didn't try to push them away. Her hands kept kneading. There was something she'd learned over years of baking. Dough needs time in the dark. Yeast needs quiet to do its work. If you pull the dough into the light too soon, if you force it to rise before it's ready, the bread won't have structure. Not because the yeast is weak, but because the time isn't right. She covered the bowl with a cloth and set it aside. The dough rested there silent. There was nothing to show that it was changing. But May knew that inside something very small was happening. Invisible, unheard, but real. She moved to another counter and began weighing ingredients for the next batch. The scale shifted slightly. May adjusted, adding a bit, taking a bit away. There was no perfect number on the first try. Only small corrections, then letting things settle. The darkness in the kitchen wasn't an absence. It was a foundation. It held the temperature steady. It protected fragile things from drying out from shock. May thought of seeds. When a seed is planted in the soil, it doesn't ask when it will see the sun. It doesn't compare itself to other seeds. It does the only thing it knows how to do, split open very slowly in the dark. Some days May wished for clearer signs, a confirmation, a rising number, proof that she wasn't standing still. But then she remembered past batches of bread. Some looked unchanged until the very last moment. Others rose too quickly, only to collapse once they hit the oven. She returned to the bowl and lifted the cloth to check. Nothing dramatic. The surface was still smooth, just slightly more taut. May wasn't disappointed. She covered it again, set a timer, and turned away. In the quiet kitchen, May made herself a cup of tea. Steam rose and dissolved into the cool air. She held the cup with both hands, leaned against the counter, and took a small sip. The taste was gentle, not striking, but enough to linger on her tongue for a moment. Maybe the hardest part of dark seasons is not knowing whether you're being nurtured or buried. And the only comfort is this: from the outside, both states look exactly the same. The difference is that in one of them, life is quietly at work beneath the surface. May set the cup down. The clock on the wall clicked softly, marking a few minutes passing. She didn't rush. She knew she didn't need to watch every second. The most important things don't follow a clock. The kitchen continued its work. The dough continued to rest. And in that just right darkness, something was beginning, even though no one could see it yet. The clock on the wall clicked again softly, like a reminder that time was still moving, even when no one was watching it closely. May set her tea down and returned to the bowl of dough. She lifted the cloth and looked a little longer this time. The surface had risen just slightly. Not much. Just enough to show that it wasn't as still as it had been before. She smiled barely. Not because of a big success, just because of the small confirmation that the process was working. May didn't poke the dough, didn't test it, didn't do anything more. She covered it again, like placing soil back over a seed that had just begun to sprout, letting it continue its work. Some changes only need to be acknowledged, not interfered with. Touching too early often comes from impatience, not care. May had learned that through many failed batches, through many moments of rushing to see results. She turned to preheat the oven. The sound of it starting up was gentle, unhurried. The air in the kitchen slowly warmed. The overhead light fell on familiar surfaces, nothing new, but nothing missing either. These things had supported her for years. May wiped her hands on her apron and leaned back against the counter, letting her body rest for a rare few minutes with nothing that needed doing. In that pause, the thoughts came back. Not as sharp as before, just softer questions. How long until I see results? How long until things feel brighter? She didn't answer them. She let them pass. Darkness, when it isn't resisted, starts to feel like soil. Soil doesn't promise anything. It simply holds. It holds moisture. It holds warmth. It keeps fragile things from drying out. And then when no one is paying attention, it allows life to push upward. May stood and began arranging the baking trays. Slow, steady movements. Nothing urgent. She placed each piece of dough with enough space between them, allowing room to rise without touching. A quiet kind of respect for each loaf's own process. When the final tray slid into the oven, May closed the door and turned the temperature dial. A small click sounded, then silence. Inside the oven, the darkness was deeper, hotter, the place where the dough would transform completely. No one could see it happening, but it was happening all the same. She turned off a few more lights, leaving the kitchen in a softer glow. May sat down on the wooden chair in the corner and closed her eyes for a moment. Not to sleep, just to stop needing to look. Her body relaxed as warmth spread through the room. Maybe not every dark season needs to be understood. Maybe some seasons only need to be trusted. Trusted that if you've planted the seed with enough care and patience, the rest is no longer in your hands. May opened her eyes and looked toward the oven. The light inside glowed faintly through the glass. She didn't stand to check, didn't lean in close. She knew this part didn't need constant watching. Everything had already been placed where it needed to be. Outside, the city was beginning to wake. Distant traffic. Another morning arriving. But inside this small kitchen, the rhythm stayed slow. Warm. Steady. May stood and tidied quietly. She didn't rush to open the oven, didn't rush to see the outcome. She allowed this moment to pass fully. Maybe darkness isn't a sign of failure. Maybe it's simply the necessary pause before something becomes strong enough to meet the light. The kitchen kept breathing. The oven kept working. And May, in that quiet, allowed herself to trust what was growing, even without yet knowing its shape. Fog doesn't arrive all at once. It spreads, very slowly. So slowly that if you're not paying attention, you only notice it once. Everything ahead feels a little less clear than before. Ava returned to her hotel room close to midnight. The long flight and the time change had left her body tired in a strange way. Not quite sleepy, not fully awake either. The hotel room felt familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. Soft yellow light, curtains drawn. She set her small suitcase against the wall, took off her shoes, and sat quietly on the edge of the bed. Ava was 29, a flight attendant used to flight maps, clear routes, destinations decided ahead of time. But when she wasn't in the air, when there was no schedule right in front of her, her life felt like it was moving through fog. No obvious wrong decision, just intersections that weren't bright enough yet to name. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a background sound like distant waves. Ava stood and pulled the curtain open slightly. Outside, the city blurred under the night lights. Streets weren't clearly visible, just patches of light melting into each other. She thought about the questions that had followed her for months. How much longer will I stay in this job? What do I want when my schedule isn't full anymore? If I stop, where would I go? The questions weren't urgent, but they lingered. Like fog, not blocking the road, just softening the view. Ava let the curtain fall back into place and returned to the bed. She turned on the bedside lamp, creating a small circle of light. Inside that circle, things were clear. Outside of it, nothing needed to be seen. She picked up the glass on the table and poured water from the pitcher. The sound of the water was gentle and steady. She took a small sip, then set the glass down. No rush, no schedule she had to follow right now. There was an image that had come to her many times, a small boat drifting through thick fog. The person steering couldn't see the far shore, couldn't see the whole river, only a few feet of water ahead of the bow. And strangely, the boat could still move forward. Not fast, not with total certainty, but enough to avoid running aground. Ava realized she had been trying to see farther than she needed to. She wanted the entire path visible before allowing herself to move. But fog doesn't work that way. It doesn't lift because you strain your eyes. It thins only as you move forward a little at a time. She lay back on the bed without pulling the blanket up yet. Just lay there, letting the mattress support her back. The air conditioner continued its steady rhythm, a background breath she didn't need to control. The quiet was wide enough for her thoughts to slow. Ava closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them again. The bedside lamp looked the same. No new information, no clear answers appearing. But there was no danger in front of her either. Just the night, the room, and a body that needed rest. She thought about flights that take off in fog. Pilots don't wait for the sky to become completely clear. They rely on the nearest instruments, the signals right in front of the aircraft. And once the plane rises, the fog stays below. Ava pulled the blanket up and placed a hand on her belly. Her breath rose and fell. Not deeper, not slower, just steady. She realized she didn't need to decide anything tonight. No need to map out the next year, just stay with the short stretch of path she could see. Outside, the city kept moving in the fog. Inside, the hotel room held its own quiet rhythm. Ava let her eyelids grow heavy, not because everything was clear, but because it didn't need to be any clearer right now. Maybe moving through fog isn't being lost. Maybe it's just the road asking us to slow down. The night in the hotel room moved more slowly than Ava expected, not because time had stretched, but because there was nothing left pushing her to keep up. The light from the bedside lamp softened in her vision as her eyelids grew heavier. The air conditioner continued its steady hum, an unchanging background sound, like a breath the room was holding for her. Ava rolled onto her side. The pillow supported her neck in a familiar way. She didn't try to find the perfect position. She simply lay in a way that asked nothing more from her body. In that just right darkness, thoughts still drifted by, but they no longer crowded the front of her mind. They stayed farther back, blurrier, like the city lights outside softened by fog. She thought again of the boat in the fog. Not a large boat, not a long journey, just a small one moving slowly, steady enough not to tip. The person steering didn't need a detailed map, didn't need to see the far shore, only needed to know which direction the bow was facing and that the water ahead was still deep enough to move through. Ava realized how often she exhausted herself by trying to see farther than the night allowed. During the day, that kind of looking ahead could be useful. But at night, seeing too far often turned into worry. It pulled the future closer than it needed to be, making things that hadn't arrived yet feel as heavy as if they already had. She took in a very gentle breath, then let it out. Not to calm anything, just letting her breath find its own rhythm. There are movements in the body that don't need willpower. When left alone, they know how to return to balance. Outside the window, the city was still there, even if Ava couldn't see it clearly. The roads were still open. The intersections still existed. Not seeing them right now didn't erase them. It simply meant they weren't needed in this moment. Ava remembered the feeling of sitting in the cockpit as a plane prepared to take off in fog. Not everything appeared at once. Only the nearest signals, a runway, a few instruments, and the trust that as the plane moved forward, visibility would open up at the right time. She rested a hand on the blanket and felt its familiar warmth. Her hand relaxed, fingers loose. No need to hold on to any decision, just knowing she was here safe in this room, in this moment. There are phases in life that don't ask us to know where we're going. They only ask us to keep moving slowly enough not to panic. And some nights, continuing simply means allowing ourselves to rest. Ava stopped trying to arrange the future in her mind. She didn't ask what would come next. She didn't force herself to feel calm. She let the night do its work, softening what didn't need to be seen yet, so the rest could rest. Her breathing became more even, not deep, not shallow, just even. With each exhale, her body felt a little heavier, as if being set down piece by piece. If the fog remained tomorrow, she would meet tomorrow then. If the road still wasn't clear, she would follow what she could see. No rush, no need for perfect certainty, just enough. In the quiet hotel room, Ava let her eyes close fully. The bedside lamp was now only a faint glow behind her eyelids. There was nothing to complete before sleep, nothing to decide. The boat continued to drift. No need to see the distant shore, only the water ahead still carrying it forward, and the night with all its softness and blur was doing that very well. The beach in the late afternoon moved at a different pace. No more loud laughter, no rush from the harsh sun. Just the steady rhythm of the waves and a light breeze carrying the smell of salt. Jason crouched near the water's edge, his hands coated in wet sand. In front of him, a sandcastle was slowly taking shape. Jason was 23, a community college student who had just finished a not-so-great semester. His grades weren't bad enough to panic over, but not good enough to feel settled either. Some nights, he lay awake thinking about the future, the way you think about a math problem with missing information. No matter how hard you try, something always feels incomplete. That afternoon, he came to the beach alone. Not to figure anything out, just to sit somewhere that didn't ask things to last. He scooped up sand, packed it down, stacked small sections one on top of another. The castle wasn't big. It had no ambition, just enough to let him see his effort turn into something visible. Each time a wave pulled back, the wet sand shimmered, reflecting the fading sky. Jason built low walls, smoothing them gently with his fingers. There was a natural focus in those repeated movements. No plan, no optimization, just being there. He thought about the plans he'd made before. Other castles, school goals, career paths, images of a clearer future. Some of them he'd built carefully, piece by piece. And then for one reason or another, they hadn't held the way he'd hoped. They didn't collapse all at once. They just softened, touched by the waves of circumstance. Jason added a small tower to one corner of the castle. It leaned slightly. He adjusted it gently, not trying to make it perfectly straight, just enough for it to stand. Wet sand holds its shape pretty well for a while. The water crept closer. A thin sheet of it brushed the base of the castle, then pulled away. It didn't destroy anything. It just left behind small grooves. Jason watched without lifting the castle higher. He knew the tide was rising on its own schedule. Something became very clear to him in that moment. Building isn't meaningless even when the result doesn't last. The feel of sand in his hands, the focus of placing each piece, the moment of seeing something he made stand even temporarily. All of it was real. Jason leaned back a little, giving the waves more room. He planted his hands behind him, feeling the cool sand under his palms. The air was softer. The sun was lower. No one was rushing him to finish before dark. A familiar fear crossed his mind. If everything I build can be washed away, what's the point of building at all? But the question felt lighter as he looked at the castle. The castle didn't ask to last forever. It only asked to be built with full presence. Jason leaned in again and fixed a small detail near the entrance. Not to make it stronger, just because he felt like it. A very small pleasure with no long-term payoff. No need for recognition. The waves returned, this time a little stronger. One corner wall collapsed slowly. No drama. The sand loosened and dissolved into the water. Jason didn't reach out to save it. He just watched. His chest didn't tighten the way he expected. There was a brief sense of loss, then it passed. Sometimes we think we're afraid of losing things, when what we're really afraid of is the act of holding on. When the grip loosens, that fear has nowhere to stand. Jason stood up and brushed the sand from his pants. He looked at the castle once more. It was still there, even with a corner gone. Enough to see that care had gone into it. Enough to know he had built it honestly. The sky shifted colors. The breeze grew cooler. Jason turned away from the castle and walked along the shoreline. He didn't need to stay for the final moment. He didn't need to make sure of anything. He knew the waves would do their work, and somehow, that knowledge made his steps feel lighter. Jason walked slowly along the shoreline, leaving faint footprints in the wet sand behind him. With each step, the prints stayed visible for a few seconds. Then the waves washed over them, unhurried, not erasing them all at once. He didn't turn around to look. Not because he wanted to forget, but because there was no need to check. The wind softened. The air was cool, carrying the familiar scent of salt and seaweed. Jason let out a long breath, as if his body were gently setting something down. Something it had been holding all day. Not a decision, just the feeling of having to hold on. He sat on a low rock near the water. Waves hit the stone, then pulled back steady and predictable. No two waves were the same, but the rhythm was familiar. Jason rested his hands on his knees, feeling the chill of the wind first, then the warmth returning as his body adjusted. He thought about the sandcastle, not its shape, but the feeling of building it. The weight of wet sand in his hands. The quiet focus of placing each small piece where it belonged. That feeling hadn't been taken by the waves. It was still there, close and intact. Maybe not everything we do needs to stay. Maybe some things only need to pass through our hands, leave a mark inside us, and then be allowed to dissolve. Like waves, like footprints, like plans that were once taken very seriously, but no longer fit who we are now. Jason lifted his gaze to the horizon. The sun hovered just above the water, its light stretched into a thin golden line. Not dramatic, not loud, just there. He didn't take a photo. He didn't try to capture the moment. Some moments are most beautiful when they don't need proof. He noticed he was no longer blaming himself for the castles that had been lost. Not because he'd figured everything out, but because he no longer saw loss as failure. It was simply part of building in a world that's always moving. The waves kept rising and falling. Somewhere behind him, the sandcastle might have collapsed further or disappeared completely. Jason didn't know. And strangely, not knowing didn't bother him. It created a light open space where he didn't have to keep watch. He stood up and brushed the sand from his hands. The sun sank a little lower. The sky deepened into blue. Jason walked toward the parking lot, not fast, not slow. His steps were steady. There was nothing he needed to rush to hold on to before night arrived. On the way back, he thought about the things he still wanted to do. Not big plans, just small things he could start then adjust as he went. Like building another sand castle someday on a different beach. Not to make it last forever, but to build it again. Sometimes we think letting go means giving up. But maybe letting go is simply allowing ourselves not to carry what has already finished its work. Those things don't disappear. They become sand. They become ground. They become what supports the next steps. Jason stopped and looked at the ocean one last time before leaving. The waves were steady, the breeze cool, nothing especially remarkable. And because of that, the moment was calm enough to set down. He turned away and walked on. Not carrying the castle, only the feeling of having built with care and having let go at the right time. The night took care of the rest. Winter doesn't always arrive with snow. Sometimes it comes as cold wind slipping through your collar, as gray skies that linger for days, as the quiet sense that everything has slowed down without any announcement. Holly stood at the bus stop, pulling her scarf tighter around her neck. It was already dark earlier than in other seasons. Streetlights flickered on their pale yellow glow, reflecting off the damp pavement. The wind wasn't strong, but it was enough to let the cold creep into every small opening. Holly was 33, a nursing assistant used to taking care of others. Her shift had ended late, her body tired, her mind empty in that specific way that comes from giving too much of yourself in one day. She stood still, not stamping her feet for warmth, not checking her phone. Just standing there, letting time pass in the cold. The bus stop was quiet. A few people stood spaced apart just far enough. No one spoke. Only the wind and the distant sound of passing cars. Holly breathed out. A thin cloud of vapor appeared, then disappeared almost instantly. She watched it, then let her eyes rest. Some seasons in life feel like a long winter. Not because something is wrong, but because nothing is growing. No clear progress. No sign that warmth is on its way. And what exhausts people most isn't the cold itself, but the fear that it might never end. Holly thought about the past few months. Shift after shift. Coming home after dark, waking up to gray mornings. She wasn't sad in a dramatic way, just quietly worn down like ground that's been frozen for too long. She wrapped her scarf tighter and pulled her sleeves down. A natural reflex, protection, warmth. In the cold, the body knows what to do, even when the mind hasn't caught up yet. The bus hadn't arrived. The digital sign blinked, showing a few more minutes. Holly didn't check it again. A few minutes or 10 wouldn't change anything. She stood there listening to her breathing, which grew steadier once she stopped trying to warm herself by constant movement. Someone walked past, leaving behind the faint smell of a damp coat. A car splashed through a puddle, sending up a few drops. The city kept living through its winter, without complaining, without apologizing. Holly remembered past winters. Some had been long, some had felt endless. And yet somehow, they had passed. Not in a single day. Not with a dramatic sign. Just one morning when the light felt slightly different, the wind less sharp, and she realized she'd made it through the coldest part. She slipped a hand into her coat pocket and touched her knitted gloves. She didn't put them on yet, just touched them. The softness eased the numbness in her fingers a little. A very small warmth, but real. There are fears that whisper, what if it stays like this forever? What if I've gone too far into winter? But winter doesn't ask for answers. It only asks to be walked through one day at a time. Holly looked up at the sky. No stars, just a deep gray stretch. She didn't search for signs of spring in this night. She didn't need to. Night isn't meant to promise anything. It only needs to be quiet enough to stand within. The bus appeared at the end of the street, its white headlights cutting through the dark. It arrived neither sooner nor later than expected. It arrived when it arrived. Holly stepped on, tapped her card, and found a seat near the window. The seat was cold at first, then slowly warmed. She leaned her head against the glass. Her breath fogged a small patch. Outside, the scenery moved past, slowly blurred. Holly didn't try to see it clearly. She didn't need to know exactly where she was passing, only that she was moving. There's something strange about winter, even when everything looks still. Something is always flowing underneath, like roots beneath frozen soil, like water moving under ice, unseen but never stopped. Holly closed her eyes, not to sleep, just to stop meeting the cold with her gaze. As the bus warmed, her body loosened slightly. Maybe this winter wasn't over yet. Maybe it would last a while longer. But that didn't mean it was all there would ever be. The bus moved on at a steady pace, the low hum of the engine like a large heartbeat, keeping the space from falling too quiet. Holly leaned against the window. Her breath fogged the glass once more, then slowly faded. She didn't wipe it away. She let the mark disappear on its own, the way many things in life do when they aren't held on to. Outside, streetlights passed one by one. Light brushed her face, then slid away, never staying long. Holly didn't count them, didn't track them. She let her eyes rest, letting her body be carried without having to stay alert. As the bus warmed, her shoulders dropped. Not because she decided to relax, but because the cold that had made her hold herself tight at the stop was no longer pressing in the same way. Some kinds of letting go happen naturally when the conditions change. Holly thought of winter as a necessary pause. No one chooses it. No one schedules it. But when it comes, the body adapts, adding layers, slowing down, staying closer to warmth. Maybe the mind needs similar things. Not big solutions, just small adjustments that make it possible to get through. She remembered a morning from years ago when winter had just begun to turn into spring. There hadn't been dramatic melting, just a shift in light. Windows that felt less cold to the touch. And she had known, without needing proof, that the hardest part was behind her. The bus turned onto a familiar street. Holly opened her eyes and looked out. Low houses, windows glowing. Somewhere someone was cooking dinner. Someone else was sitting quietly after a long day. Each home held its own rhythm. No need to match another. She slipped a hand into her pocket, touched her gloves again, then pulled them out and put them on. This time it wasn't because she was too cold. It was because she wanted the warmth more clearly. A small choice, but enough. The fear that winter might never end was no longer standing right in front of her. It hadn't disappeared, but it had stepped back. Winter might still be here, but it wasn't the whole picture. The bus stopped. Holly stood and stepped down. The air outside was colder than inside the bus, but it didn't shock her the way it had earlier. Her body had adjusted. She pulled her scarf up and walked slowly toward home. The porch light turned on as she approached. A small circle of light opened in the darkness. Holly paused for a moment, breathing in, then out. This breath wasn't rushed. It didn't need to be. Some seasons don't ask us to be strong. They only ask us to keep going, to stay warm enough, not to go numb, and to trust that the light will change when it's time. Holly opened the door and stepped inside. The space was warmer, quieter. She took off her coat, hung it up, set her bag down. Familiar movements, gentle ones, like a ritual of bringing her body back home. Outside, winter continued doing its work. But inside this small house, there was warmth enough to rest. And sometimes, one warm space is all it takes to make it through a season. Holly turned off a few lights and walked toward her bedroom. The night didn't ask her to see spring yet. It only asked her to rest so that when spring did arrive, she would still have the strength to notice it. Some endings aren't loud. There's no clear goodbye, no door slamming shut. Just an ordinary evening when you suddenly realize you've been standing in a doorway for too long, and behind you, a door has already closed quietly. Ben sat alone in the office. Most of the overhead lights were off now, leaving only the dim glow of his laptop screen and a small desk lamp tucked into the corner. Outside the glass wall, the city still held a few scattered lights, but they were thinning. The air conditioner hummed steadily, a background rhythm, trying to keep the space from falling into complete silence. Ben was 31, working in a startup used to things being not finished. At home or at the office, his mind always carried a list what still needed fixing, optimizing, catching up. For him, endings were usually just pauses before picking things back up. But tonight felt different. Tonight, the sense of, "I'll restart this," didn't feel as certain. On the screen was a short email. Not many words. Not rude. Not dramatic. Just a polite notice that the partner was pulling out. A project he'd prepared for over months, calls, plans, pitch decks revised late into the night. And in the end, the result fit neatly into a few courteous lines. Ben had read the email many times. Each time his brain automatically searched for a crack. Maybe they'd change their mind. Maybe he could persuade them. Maybe he could revise the proposal. He was used to reopening doors that seemed closed. In the past, sometimes it worked. But some doors don't close because of a lack of effort. They close because the timing has shifted. He placed both hands on the keyboard as if typing a few lines could reverse everything. His fingers hovered, then stopped. He noticed the tension in his wrists, in his jaw too. A familiar bracing, like preparing for an argument or a final sprint. He let out a breath slower than usual, not because he was trying to calm down, just because his body was tired of staying ready to fight. Ben looked around the office. On the wall, a whiteboard filled with arrows, boxes, and half-erased notes. On the corner of the desk, an old coffee cup, the ice long melted. Everything looked like a place still in motion, even though the only person left was sitting still. He thought about the idea of a closed door. It sounded like a comforting phrase people used to soften disappointment. But tonight, it wasn't a phrase. It was physical. Like placing your hand on a doorknob, trying to turn it and realizing the lock is set. You can turn it again. You can knock. But the other side stays silent. What exhausted Ben wasn't losing the opportunity itself. It was the fact that his mind kept running, as if the opportunity were still in his hands. With each loop of thought, another version appeared. If only I'd sent the email earlier. If only I'd chosen different words. If only I hadn't missed that call. Those if onlys felt like standing in front of a closed door, blaming yourself for not stepping through in time. Ben rested a hand on the laptop lid. It was slightly warm. He didn't close it right away. He just kept his hand there, noticing a simple truth tonight. There might be nothing left to fix immediately, not because he had failed, but because the situation had changed shape. He stood and walked toward the glass wall. The city outside looked blurrier now. Distant lights made everything feel like it was drifting. Ben rested his forehead lightly against the cold glass, then stepped back. The chill pulled him into the present like a quiet reminder. I'm here, right now, in a silent room. He returned to the desk and sat down. This time he didn't open another tab. He didn't search for more data. He read the email once more, then let the cursor sit still. His hand rested on the trackpad, but didn't move. There was a very small moment, almost invisible from the outside, when Ben allowed himself not to know the next step. Not knowing didn't mean giving up. It meant that for the first time in months, he didn't have to force the future to be clear in the middle of the night. He closed the laptop. The soft click echoed quietly through the office. Not a slam, just the sound of something being set down. Ben stayed seated after that sound, feeling the silence flow into the space it created. A door had closed. But the most exhausting part wasn't the door itself. It was the habit of standing there, staring at it, and blaming yourself. And in this moment, Ben wasn't doing that anymore. He just sat, listened to the hum of the air conditioner, and let the night hold the rest for him. After closing the laptop, Ben didn't stand up right away. He stayed seated in the dimmer room, as if his body needed a buffer between running and stopped. The air conditioner kept humming unchanged, a steady background rhythm that kept the space from feeling too empty. He placed both hands on his thighs, not clenched, not tense, just resting there. It felt strange having hands that didn't need to be ready for the next task, but it also felt light, like setting down something he'd been carrying for too long. Ben stood up and turned off the desk lamp. The office sank into softer light enough to move around without seeing every detail clearly. The writing on the whiteboard faded into pale shapes. He didn't erase anything. There was no need. Those ideas had already done their work in that phase. He put on his jacket and stepped into the hallway. The office door closed behind him without a loud sound. Just the ordinary noise of a door being shut at the right time. Ben paused for a second, rested his hand on the handle, then walked away. He didn't look back. The hallway was quiet. Motion sensor lights turned on as he passed, then dimmed again behind him. Each section lit up, then faded, as if the building itself were guiding him into a different part of itself. Not fast, not slow. Outside, the night air was cool. Ben breathed in, then out. This breath wasn't cut short. No thoughts interrupted it. Just the breath of someone who had just stepped out of a closed room. He walked to the parking lot. The pavement reflected the lights in soft patches. Few cars, little noise. Ben opened his car door and sat down, but didn't start the engine yet. His hand rested on the steering wheel, feeling its familiar surface. A thought passed through him. If I don't keep going down the old path, where do I go next? But the question didn't tighten his chest like before. It was there, light, not demanding an answer right away. Like another room waiting, one that didn't need to be opened tonight. Ben started the car. The engine vibrated briefly, then settled. He drove out of the lot more slowly than usual. Not because he was tired, but because there was nothing he needed to chase right now. Traffic lights changed. The city at night unfolded in small sections. Ben didn't think about strategy, didn't think about emails, didn't think about proving anything. He let the road reveal itself piece by piece, just enough to drive. Some doors, when they close, don't immediately reveal another door in front of you. They create an empty space instead. And that space isn't always a loss. Sometimes it's the room you need to realize how cramped you've been standing for a long time. The car turned onto a familiar street. Porch lights glowed at a few houses. Ben slowed down and parked in front of his place. He turned off the engine and sat for a moment longer. Not out of regret, just because his body liked this slower rhythm. He went inside and turned on a small light. The space was quiet. Nothing needed fixing. Nothing was waiting to be finished. Ben set his keys on the table and hung his jacket on the hook. Small, ordinary movements, but they carried the feeling of coming home. He stood in the living room for a bit. Didn't turn on the TV, didn't check his phone. Just stood there, letting the silence spread. Maybe tomorrow he'd think about a different direction. Maybe another door would appear. Or maybe not yet. But tonight he didn't need to open any new doors. One had already closed, and he had stepped away from its threshold. Ben turned off the lights and walked toward the bedroom. The night didn't ask him to know where he was going next. It only asked him to rest inside the new space that had quietly opened the space of not having to push anymore. Fear doesn't always show up as panic. Sometimes it shows up as distance, a mind that keeps leaning forward, imagining everything that could go wrong, everything that hasn't happened yet. Your body might be standing still, but your thoughts are already far ahead, scanning the future, like it's a cliff you're about to fall from. Tyler learned this slowly. He was 34, a park ranger in a mountain region where people often came looking for quiet, but didn't always know what to do with it once they found it. That night, he was alone in the small ranger cabin, the kind with thick wooden walls and a single window facing the dark slope of the mountain. The wind moved through the trees outside, low and steady, not loud enough to be dramatic, just present. Tyler wasn't afraid of the mountain itself. He'd hiked it in every season. He knew the trails, the loose rocks, the places where snow stayed longer than expected. What unsettled him wasn't the terrain, it was the stretch of unknown ahead of him. A transfer request he hadn't answered yet, a relationship that felt like it was quietly changing shape. A future that didn't look dangerous, but didn't look clear either. He sat at the small table, boots still on, jacket unzipped. His headlamp rested beside his hand. He picked it up, turned it on, and pointed it toward the floor. The beam cut a clean circle of light over the wooden boards. Everything beyond that circle stayed dark. Tyler noticed something he'd known for years, but had forgotten to apply to himself. When you're climbing in the dark, you don't look down the mountain. You don't look for the summit either. You look for the next place to put your foot. That's it. One step, then another. Fear has a way of convincing you to look everywhere except where you are. His thoughts kept pulling him forward. What if this choice closes the wrong door? What if I regret it? What if I don't see the danger coming? Each question widened the imagined drop in front of him. The future became a vast space with no edges, no markers, no handholds. Tyler exhaled slowly and brought the light back down to the floor. The wood grain, a scratch near the leg of the chair, dust that would need to be swept in the morning. Ordinary things, solid things, the kind of details that don't disappear when you're afraid. Outside, the wind shifted. A branch tapped lightly against the cabin wall, then went still again. The mountain wasn't rushing him. The night wasn't demanding answers. He remembered his first winter climb years ago, how his instructor had stopped him mid-trail when Tyler froze, staring down a steep slope. "Don't argue with the height," the man had said quietly. "Just place your foot." Back then, it hadn't felt like wisdom. It had felt like survival. Now, sitting alone in the cabin, Tyler understood it differently. Fear wasn't asking him to solve his life. It was just asking for attention. And attention didn't mean obedience. He stood up, took a few steps toward the door, then paused. His hand rested on the handle. He didn't open it. He didn't need to. He just needed to feel the weight of his body balanced upright here. There was something grounding about realizing that even if the path ahead changed, this step, this moment, was stable. The floor held him. The walls held the warmth. The night held everything else without explanation. Tyler turned off the headlamp and let the darkness return. It didn't feel threatening now. It felt wide, like a space that didn't need to be filled. Fear often imagines the worst possible version of tomorrow. But tomorrow never arrives all at once. It comes as moments, steps, small decisions made with the information you have, not the information you wish you had. Tyler sat back down. He unlaced his boots slowly, listening to the soft rasp of fabric and metal. When he finished, he lined them up by the door, neat but not perfect. He didn't check his phone. He didn't rehearse conversations that hadn't happened yet. He let the mountain be what it was, something large, something steady, something that didn't need him to conquer it tonight. Sometimes peace doesn't come from feeling brave. It comes from remembering that you're not required to see the whole path, only the ground beneath you. The wind outside softened. The cabin settled into its quiet creaks and pauses. Tyler leaned back in his chair and allowed his gaze to rest on nothing in particular. The next step could wait. For now, this one was enough. Later that night, the cabin grew quieter in a way Tyler could feel rather than hear. The wind didn't stop, it just became part of the background, like a low breath moving through the trees. The kind of sound you don't need to follow. The kind that keeps going whether you pay attention or not. Tyler lay back on the narrow bed near the wall. He didn't turn off the small lamp right away. Its light was soft, barely reaching the corners of the room, leaving most things in shadow. The ceiling above him was simple wood. Nothing to figure out, nothing to interpret. His mind tried once or twice to wander ahead again, to the transfer request, to the future version of himself that might look back and judge this moment. But the thoughts didn't have the same grip. They arrived without urgency, then drifted off when nothing responded. He brought his attention to his body instead. The way the mattress supported his weight, the way his shoulders sank slightly once he stopped holding them up, the quiet rhythm of his breath already slower than before. In the mountains, Tyler knew panic often came from looking too far. People slipped not because the ground disappeared, but because their attention did. They leaned forward before their footing was secure. Fear works the same way in the mind. Tyler let that idea pass without holding on to it. He didn't need to turn it into ideas. He'd learned enough to know that understanding something didn't always mean doing something with it. Outside, a distant animal call echoed once, then faded. It didn't trigger alarm. It was just another reminder that the night had its own movements, its own language. One that didn't ask for interpretation. Tyler reached over and turned off the lamp. Darkness filled the room, but not completely. There was still a thin outline of the window, a faint suggestion of trees beyond it. Enough to orient himself, enough to feel safe. He remembered how on night climbs, experienced climbers trusted their lights not to show the whole route, but to show enough. Enough rock, enough ground, enough information to take the next step without guessing. That was all the light was ever meant to do. Fear often demands certainty. It wants guarantees, full maps, complete explanations. But the body doesn't need all that to rest. The body only needs to know that right now, it's not falling. Tyler placed one hand on his chest, the other resting loosely at his side. His fingers were relaxed, not curled into fists. His breath moved in and out without effort, without correction. The mountain didn't ask him to decide anything tonight. The future didn't ask him to arrive early. There was a quiet relief in realizing that uncertainty wasn't a threat. It was simply space. Space where things hadn't formed yet. Space that didn't need to be filled with fear. Tyler's thoughts grew less specific. They lost their sharp edges, becoming more like impressions than sentences. The idea of tomorrow softened. The need to resolve anything faded into the background. He didn't tell himself to sleep. He didn't tell himself to relax. He just stayed with the steady feeling of being held by the bed. Stayed with the sound of wind passing through branches. Stayed with the simple fact of being here now, without needing to move. At some point, the distinction between listening and drifting began to blur. His awareness widened, then thinned like a beam of light slowly dimming. The path ahead would still be there in the morning. The choices would still wait. For now there was no cliff, only solid ground beneath him, only one step already taken, and that was enough to let the night carry the rest. By the time Rachel reached the parking lot, the rain had already decided what kind of night it was going to be. Not a storm, not anything dramatic, just steady rain falling straight down, soaking everything without asking permission. She paused beside her car keys, still in her hand, watching water slide across the windshield in thin, uneven lines. Her jacket was already damp at the shoulders. She could feel the cold beginning to seep in, the kind that doesn't shock you, just slowly settles. Rachel was 39, a single mom, an office administrator who spent most of her day holding things together quietly. Schedules, requests, small crises that weren't hers but somehow landed on her desk anyway. By the time she clocked out, she felt emptied out in a way that sleep alone didn't always fix. She opened the car door and sat down, closing it with a dull, heavy sound. The rain drummed softly on the roof, not loud, not gentle, just constant. For a moment, she didn't start the engine. She rested her forehead lightly against the steering wheel, eyes open, watching the wipers drag water aside only for it to return again. Clear, blurred, clear, blurred. That's what the day had felt like. Her mind replayed the small things. A missed call from her son's school, a comment from her supervisor that wasn't criticism but wasn't reassurance either. A to-do list that kept rearranging itself no matter how many boxes she checked. None of it was unbearable. All of it together felt heavy. Rachel sighed and leaned back into the seat. The rain didn't stop. It didn't respond to her mood. It didn't speed up or slow down because she needed a break. And oddly, that helped. Rain had a way of doing that, reminding her that not everything was reacting to her effort. Some things were simply happening whether she managed them or not. She turned the key. The engine came to life with a low hum. The heater kicked in slowly, air still cool at first. She reached up and wiped a small circle on the windshield with her sleeve, then stopped. The glass fogged again almost immediately. No point fighting it. Rachel let the wipers do their steady work. Back and forth, back and forth. Each pass cleared the view just enough to see the painted lines on the asphalt shining faintly under the lot lights. Driving home in the rain always made time stretch. Traffic slowed. Everyone moved more carefully. There was less urgency in the air, as if the world itself had decided to ease up. As she pulled out of the lot, Rachel noticed how the rain softened the edges of everything. Streetlights blurred into warm halos. Brake lights smeared into red reflections on the road. The usual sharpness of the city faded. She didn't have to see far ahead, just the car in front of her, just the curve of the road. Fear often showed up for Rachel like this, not as terror, but as accumulation. A sense that if she wasn't careful, something would slip. Something would go wrong. Someone would need her, and she'd be one step behind. But the rain didn't ask her to hurry. It soaked the road evenly, washing dust into the gutters, dulling the sharpness of the day. She remembered standing in rain as a kid, hating the wet clothes, loving the smell afterward. The way everything felt quieter once the rain passed. Rachel loosened her grip on the steering wheel. She hadn't noticed how tight it was until her hands relaxed. The car moved steadily forward. No skidding, no drama, just motion. The rain didn't fix anything. It didn't solve her problems. It didn't rearrange her responsibilities. But it changed the texture of the moment. And sometimes that was enough. She turned onto her street windshield wipers, still keeping rhythm, and felt a small, unfamiliar sense of relief. Not because things were suddenly better, but because she wasn't fighting the weather anymore. The rain could fall. The road could be wet. Her day could be heavy, and she could still make it home. By the time Rachel pulled into her driveway, the rain had softened into something quieter. It still fell, but more patiently now, as if it had said what it needed to say and was content to keep going without attention. She turned off the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of cooling metal. The rain tapping gently on the windshield. The house in front of her looked dim and familiar. One porch light glowing like it always did. Nothing about it promised answers. It just promised shelter. Rachel stepped out of the car and felt the wet ground beneath her shoes. The air smelled clean in a way it hadn't earlier, washed of dust and heat. She didn't rush. If her jacket got wetter, that was fine. It wasn't something she needed to fix right now. Inside, she kicked off her shoes by the door and hung her jacket on the back of a chair. A small puddle formed on the floor beneath it. She noticed it, then decided to leave it for later. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that didn't feel empty, just paused. She moved through the living room, turning on a lamp instead of the overhead light. The softer glow made the space feel gentler, as if the day had loosened its grip the moment she walked in. She filled a glass with water, took a slow sip, then another. Rain had a way of doing this, not erasing what came before, but rinsing it. Letting the sharp edges dull, letting things settle where they landed instead of scattering them further. Rachel sat down on the couch and leaned back, listening to the distant sound of rain through the walls. It was muffled now, almost like a memory of sound rather than the thing itself. Her shoulders dropped a little, then a little more. The worries from earlier didn't disappear. They were still there somewhere. Tomorrow would still come with its questions. Her responsibilities hadn't changed shape just because it rained. But the fear that usually wrapped itself tightly around those thoughts had loosened. She noticed how fear often tried to rush her, to solve, to plan, to imagine outcomes before they arrived. It liked to stay ahead of time, as if being prepared meant being safe. But tonight, the rain had slowed everything down enough that rushing felt unnecessary. The future could wait outside like the rain itself. Present, but not pressing. Rachel closed her eyes for a moment. Not to escape, just to rest them. Her breath found its own rhythm, longer on the exhale, quieter on the inhale. She didn't adjust it. She didn't guide it. She let it be what it was. There was a strange comfort in realizing that change didn't always announce itself dramatically. Sometimes it came like rain, inconvenient, unwelcome, unavoidable, and then quietly did its work. The road outside had been dusty before. Tires kicked up grit, Wind carried it everywhere. Now it lay darker, smoother, easier to drive on. The rain hadn't asked whether the dust wanted to leave. It just passed through. Rachel opened her eyes and looked around the room again. Everything was still where she left it. The couch, the lamp, the faint reflection in the window. But something inside her had shifted just enough to notice. She stood up, turned off the lamp, and let the room return to shadow. The house didn't need to be perfectly dry. The day didn't need to be perfectly understood. In the bedroom, she lay down without checking her phone, without rehearsing conversations or scanning tomorrow's list. The rain outside continued steady and unbothered. If fear was imagination reaching too far ahead, then peace, she realized, might be this allowing the moment to be exactly what it was, without adding more weight to it. The rain would stop when it stopped. The road would dry when it dried. Tomorrow would arrive when it arrived. For now, there was nothing she needed to outrun, nothing she needed to solve. Just the quiet work of letting the day be washed clean enough to rest. And as the rain carried the last of the dust away, Rachel let the night carry the rest. The leaf had been there longer than Susan expected. It clung to the bare branch outside her window long after the others had let go. Day after day, the tree stood almost empty, its limbs thin against the sky, while that one leaf remained brown at the edges, curled inward, still attached. Susan noticed it one quiet afternoon when she sat by the window with a book she wasn't really reading. The light was soft, the kind that only comes late in the season. Not warm, not cold, just tired. She was 62 now, a librarian for most of her life. Someone who had learned to love slow things, pages turning shelves, settling the low hum of a building holding its breath. Change had never frightened her loudly. It arrived for her in subtler ways. Retirements, empty desks, names that stopped appearing on holiday cards. The leaf didn't move much. Even when the wind came through it, only trembled slightly, as if unsure whether it was ready. Susan found herself watching it longer than she meant to, wondering what kept it there. She told herself it was just biology. A stronger stem, a sheltered angle. Nothing poetic about it. And yet, she kept looking. Later that evening, she stepped out onto the porch, wrapping a cardigan around her shoulders. The air smelled like damp earth and old wood. Somewhere nearby, crickets began their steady rhythm, not loud, not shy. The tree stood just a few steps from the porch railing. Up close, the leaf looked thinner than she'd imagined. Fragile, almost translucent where the light passed through. Susan reached out not to touch it, but to steady herself against the railing. She remembered autumns from years ago when her husband would rake leaves into uneven piles and complain about how they never stayed where he put them. She smiled faintly at the memory, then felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came when a thought didn't have anywhere to land. Loss didn't always arrive as a sharp event. Sometimes it lingered like this leaf refusing to fall when everything else already had. Susan had learned to live alongside that kind of absence. The quiet seat at the table. The extra mug she no longer needed. The way evenings stretched longer now. She didn't push the feeling away. She let it rest the same way she let the night settle around her. The leaf rustled once, then stilled again. There was something oddly comforting about it. Not the holding on, but the patience. The leaf wasn't fighting gravity. It wasn't resisting change with effort. It was simply still there for now. Susan thought about all the endings she had feared when she was younger. The ones she imagined would break her. The ones she thought she wouldn't survive. Most of them hadn't come the way she expected. And when they did come, they didn't erase her. They rearranged her life quietly, slowly, until she learned how to stand in the new shape. She sat down on the porch chair, the wood creaking beneath her weight. The sound felt familiar, grounding. She watched her breath fog faintly in the cooler air, then disappear. Impermanence, she knew, wasn't a threat. It was a rhythm. Everything entered, everything left. Even the things that stayed longer than expected eventually followed the same pattern. Still knowing something and feeling ready for it were different things. Susan closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the crickets, the distant sound of a car passing somewhere far away. The night didn't hurry the leaf. It didn't insist on anything. When she opened her eyes again, the leaf was still there. She smiled at that. Not because she needed it to stay forever, but because it was allowed to stay as long as it did. Some endings don't need to be forced. Some beginnings don't announce themselves. Sometimes life simply waits until everything is ready. Susan leaned back, letting the chair support her, letting the quiet do its work. The leaf would fall when it fell, or it wouldn't. Either way, the tree already knew how to grow again. The leaf stayed through the night. Susan noticed it again in the morning light, still holding on, still quiet. Frost traced a thin line along the railing, and the air carried that clean, almost metallic chill that came just before winter settled in. Nothing felt rushed. Nothing felt unfinished. She made her tea and stood by the window while it steeped, watching the branch sway gently. The leaf moved with it, now less rigid than before, as if it had loosened its grip without letting go entirely. Susan didn't wonder when it would fall anymore. The question had softened into something less sharp. She was more curious about how it stayed present in this in-between moment, not fully alive, not yet gone. That space felt familiar. So much of her life now existed there, between who she had been and who she was becoming. Between the roles she once filled and the quieter ones she was learning to accept. Between holding and releasing. She carried her tea out to the porch again, the mug warming her hands. The chair creaked in the same place as the night before. The sound reassured her that some things at least were consistent. The leaf trembled once in a breeze that barely deserved the name. It turned slightly, catching the light. For a second, its veins glowed faintly, like a map no one needed to read anymore. Susan felt no urgency rise in her chest. No need to intervene. No need to wish for anything to happen faster. Loss had taught her that endings didn't require her permission. They arrived when they arrived. And beginnings, she had learned, were often too quiet to notice at first. She thought of the library she would leave behind in a few months, the shelves that would still hold their weight, the readers who would come and go without knowing her name. It no longer felt like erasure. It felt like continuity. The leaf shifted again. Then, without ceremony, it let go. There was no sound when it fell, no dramatic motion. It drifted downward in a slow, uneven path, turning once then again before resting on the ground beneath the tree. Susan watched without flinching. Something inside her loosened, not in grief, but in recognition. This was how it happened. This was how it always happened. Not with force, but with timing. She stayed where she was breathing evenly, allowing the moment to complete itself without adding a story to it. The tree stood bare now, unremarkable, ready for its next quiet season. In a few months, new leaves would appear without asking whether the old ones had been missed. Susan finished her tea. The warmth spread through her chest, steady and kind. She set the mug down and rested her hands in her lap, palms open, fingers relaxed. Change, she realized, didn't mean disappearance. It meant movement. It meant making room. The fallen leaf would return to the earth. The tree would use what remained. Nothing was wasted. She stood up and went back inside, leaving the porch as it was. The day would unfold on its own. There was nothing she needed to carry forward from the night before. Impermanence wasn't a loss of ground. It was the ground itself, always shifting, always supporting the next step. And as the morning light grew a little brighter, Susan felt ready to move with it slowly, without fear, trusting the quiet intelligence of change. The door was already open, not wide like a grand invitation, just open in a quiet, ordinary way, like someone had stepped out for a second and never bothered to close it again. A thin line of air moved through the gap, carrying the smell of early evening warm pavement, distant food, the faint sweetness of someone's laundry sheet on a balcony nearby. Inside, everything looked normal. A small apartment, a soft lamp in the corner, a cup with a little tea gone lukewarm, the low hum of the refrigerator steady and patient. The kind of room where nothing is chasing you. And still the body sat like it was waiting for permission. It was a Saturday. Not a dramatic Saturday, not a big planned day. Just the kind of weekend day that feels wide at first and then suddenly disappears. There had been laundry, a quick grocery run, a half-hearted attempt to clean the kitchen counter, a few minutes of scrolling that turned into an hour. Nothing had gone wrong. Nothing urgent was happening, but the mind was doing that thing again, turning small thoughts into tight loops. It started with one simple question: what should I do with my life? It always started like that, as if the mind was just being responsible, as if it was trying to help. Then the question split into smaller questions, like a crack in glass that spreads. What if I'm behind? What if I'm wasting time? What if I choose wrong? What if everyone else figured it out and I didn't? Each thought felt sharp for a second, then dulled, then returned again from a different angle. The body stayed on the couch, phone face down on the coffee table, as if even the screen had become too loud. There was a feeling in the chest, tight, not painful, just braced, like the muscles were holding up an invisible weight. The balcony door was open because earlier there had been a moment of hope. The air outside had looked softer. The sky had been that calm blue-gray color that makes people pause without knowing why. The thought had been, I should step out there, just for a minute. But just for a minute had turned into maybe later. Now later had arrived, and the door was still open and the body was still inside. It wasn't fear in a big, obvious way. There was no panic, no shaking hands. It was smaller than that. It was the quiet hesitation that comes from habit. The way you can stand in front of a fridge full of food and still feel like there's nothing you want. The way you can be free and still feel stuck. The mind said, what's the point? Then it said, what if it doesn't help? Then it said, what if stepping outside makes you feel worse? The thoughts were quick, like a small bird fluttering in place, beating its wings without going anywhere. There was a memory then, almost silly. A childhood image from a school trip, a small bird in a classroom cage. The teacher had opened the door to show the kids something about kindness, about release. Everyone had leaned in, waiting for the moment the bird would fly out. But the bird didn't move. It just sat there, head-turning eyes, bright body, perfectly still. The door was open. The sky was right there. But the bird stayed inside, not because it wanted to suffer, but because it didn't fully believe the opening was real. Or maybe it did believe it and still didn't know what to do with it. The body on the couch remembered that moment without trying. And suddenly the open balcony door didn't feel like a doorway. It felt like a question. Why don't we leave when the door is open? Why do we stay in the familiar cage even when the bars aren't locked? The mind offered answers, of course, it always does. It said, because outside is unpredictable. It said, because inside is known. It said, because what if you fly out and you still don't feel better? But beneath those answers was something more honest, a quieter truth. The cage isn't always made of walls. Sometimes it's made of old beliefs, old reactions, old patterns that once kept you safe. Like the belief that you need to be ready at all times. Like the belief that rest is suspicious. Like the belief that if you stop thinking something important will be missed. On the coffee table, the mug sat untouched. The tea smelled faintly herbal, like chamomile, like something meant to calm. The irony wasn't lost, but there was no need to judge it. The room wasn't wrong. The person wasn't wrong. The moment was simply showing itself. The body finally leaned forward, elbows on knees. Not as a big decision, but as a shift. A tiny movement toward something else. Toward air, toward space. Feet found the floor. Bare feet on cool wood. That sensation alone felt like information, real simple present. Not the future, not a story, just the floor. The mind tried one more time. Don't bother, it won't change anything. But the body didn't argue. It didn't need to win. It just took one small step. Not all the way outside. Just closer to the open door. And in that closer space, the air touched the face barely, like a soft hand. The night didn't demand anything. It didn't ask for a plan. It didn't ask for progress. It didn't ask for clarity. It just offered space. The door was still open. And for the first time all day, The person noticed something simple and surprising. They weren't trapped. They were just used to staying. Standing closer to the open door changed very little on the outside. The street was the same. The sky was still that soft, fading blue. A car passed tires whispering against asphalt. Somewhere nearby, a radio played low enough that it sounded like memory instead of music. But inside, something had shifted. Not a breakthrough, not relief, just a loosening. Like the body had stopped leaning away from something it had been avoiding without realizing it. The shoulders dropped a fraction. The breath moved lower, deeper without instruction. It wasn't calm yet. It was space. And space was enough for now. The mind didn't disappear. It rarely does. It stayed nearby, alert, cautious. It said, "Okay, but what now?" It said, "You can't just stand here forever." It said, "This doesn't solve anything." None of that was wrong. But none of it needed an answer in this moment. The open door didn't promise a solution. It wasn't a guarantee of happiness or clarity or a better life. It was simply an opening, a pause in the pattern, a chance to notice how much effort had been going into staying exactly where things felt familiar. There was another step, small, barely noticeable. One foot crossed the threshold and rested on the balcony floor. Cool concrete this time, different from the wood inside. Different textures, different temperatures. The body registered it before the mind could comment. The second foot followed. Now fully outside, the person didn't feel free or brave or transformed. They felt exposed, just a little. Like taking off a layer you'd been wearing for years and suddenly realizing the air touches you everywhere. It wasn't uncomfortable exactly, just unfamiliar. The balcony was small. A chair pushed against the wall, a plant that needed more water than it was getting, a railing with chipped paint. Nothing inspiring, nothing cinematic, just a place between inside and outside. The city moved on, unconcerned. People walked dogs. Lights flicked on in windows across the street. Life continued at its own pace, indifferent to whether anyone had figured themselves out or not. And that was the strange comfort of it. The world wasn't waiting for permission. The mind had spent so long believing that staying alert, staying tense, staying inside the cage was a form of control, that if it could just think far enough ahead, prepare thoroughly enough, worry responsibly enough, it could prevent pain, prevent regret, prevent mistakes. But standing there now, it was clear how little of that was true. The train of life didn't slow down when you stayed awake worrying. It didn't speed up when you relaxed. It didn't change direction because you replayed conversations or rehearsed futures. It moved according to its own tracks. And somehow knowing that didn't feel threatening. It felt relieving. There was a moment of sadness then, soft but real. A grief for all the time spent sitting just inside open doors. For all the chances to rest that had been postponed. For all the moments when the cage had been assumed locked, even when it wasn't. The sadness didn't need fixing either. It came and settled like a bird landing briefly on a railing. It didn't demand a story. It didn't ask to be pushed away. It was just there, sharing the space. The body leaned against the railing. The cool metal pressed into forearms. The breath moved in and out steady enough. The night air carried sounds and smells without explanation. Someone laughed 2 buildings over. A siren rose and faded. The ordinary orchestra of evening played on. Here was another quiet realization: flying away was never the requirement. Freedom wasn't about leaving everything behind. It wasn't about dramatic escapes or bold moves or perfect timing. It was about knowing you could move if you wanted to. About understanding that the door wasn't locked. That staying was a choice, not a sentence. The bird in the classroom cage hadn't flown out right away. Maybe it never did. Maybe it sat there for a long time, head turning, learning the shape of the opening. Learning that the air beyond the bars didn't bite. Learning that nothing bad happened just because the door was open. Maybe that was enough. The person stayed on the balcony a little longer, not to accomplish anything, not to chase a feeling, just to be there. To let the nervous system adjust to not being clenched. To let the idea of openness settle without being forced into action. Eventually, there would be a return inside. The door would be slid shut gently. Dinner would be made or not made. Tomorrow would come with its questions and uncertainties. None of that had vanished. But something important had changed. The cage was no longer mistaken for safety. The door was no longer invisible. And whether the bird flew or stayed, one thing was now clear. It wasn't trapped. It never had been. It started as something small. Not a crisis, not a big feeling. Just an itch, one of those irritating little sensations that shows up for no clear reason. A spot on the arm that suddenly demanded attention. The kind of thing you can ignore for a few seconds until you notice you're thinking about it. And then, almost without meaning to, you scratch. At first it feels helpful, like relief, like you fixed it. But then it comes back, stronger this time, sharper, like the skin learned a new way to complain. So you scratch again, a little harder, a little longer, chasing that clean moment when it stops. Except it doesn't stop. It spreads. That night, the apartment was quiet, in the way it usually is when the day finally lets go. The overhead lights were off. A single lamp made the walls look softer, like they had less to say. The TV wasn't on. The phone was charging face down. In the kitchen, the dishwasher ran with a low, steady swish, like waves in a small indoor ocean. The person had been trying to relax. That was the plan anyway. A shower, comfortable clothes, something warm to drink, a normal wind down. Nothing special. But the mind had an itch too. It had latched onto a moment from earlier in the day, one sentence spoken in a meeting. Not even a terrible sentence. Not an obvious mistake. Just a comment that landed oddly, followed by a half-second pause from someone else. A half-second pause. That was all it took. Now, hours later, that pause had become a whole movie in the mind. The mind replayed it with different camera angles. It zoomed in. It added meaning. It wrote subtitles. It asked, "Why did you say that?" Then it asked, "What did they think?" Then it asked, "What does this mean about you?" The body sat on the couch, one leg tucked under the other, fingers tapping lightly against the fabric, as if the hands needed something to do with all this energy. The dishwasher sound kept going steady and calm, like the world didn't care about a half-second pause in a meeting. But the mind cared. The mind cared a lot. It scratched at the memory the way a hand scratches at skin. Maybe you should have phrased it differently. Maybe you look stupid. Maybe they're talking about it. Maybe you always do this. Maybe this is why you can't get ahead. The thoughts felt urgent, like they were trying to protect something. Like they were warning you so you wouldn't be hurt again. And in a strange way, that's what they were doing. Overthinking isn't always vanity. Sometimes it's a nervous system trying to stay safe. Sometimes it's the brain believing that if it analyzes pain in advance, it can prevent pain later. It's not logical, but it is familiar. It's like scratching. It comes from the honest desire for relief, but it doesn't deliver relief. Not for long. The person reached up and rubbed the inside of the wrist, an absent gesture like the body was acting out the metaphor without knowing it. There was a real itch there too, probably from dry skin, maybe from a new detergent. The rubbing turned into scratching, and for a second it felt better. Then it got worse. The skin warmed under the fingernails. The itch spread outward like little sparks. The person stopped surprised and stared at the spot as if it had betrayed them. And that's when something clicked. This is exactly what happens in the mind. You poke at a worry. You pick at a thought. You scratch at a memory. And instead of healing it, you inflame it. Not because you're doing it wrong, not because you're weak, but because some things don't settle through force. Some things settle through non-reaction, through leaving them alone long enough for the body to realize it's safe. The person leaned back against the couch cushion, the fabric cool against the shoulders. The dishwasher swished. The lamp hummed faintly. The room held steady. The mind, though, wanted to keep going. It wanted to keep scratching at the meeting moment. It wanted to squeeze meaning out of it until something finally felt certain. Certainty the mind promised would feel like relief. But certainty wasn't available. Not tonight. Not with that old moment. So the next best thing was something simpler, noticing the urge to scratch. The person didn't try to stop thinking altogether. That would have felt like trying not to itch. Impossible. And weirdly stressful. Instead, the person just noticed the motion inside the reach, the grab the pick. There it is again. The mind going back. The mind touching the sore spot. The person took a slow breath, not as a technique, not as a performance. Just a breath that happened when the shoulders finally dropped. And then something even stranger happened. The thought came back, but it landed softer. It still said, "That was awkward," but it didn't immediately become, "You are awkward." That small difference mattered. The itch in the wrist was still there too faintly. The skin still wanted attention, but the person kept the hand still resting it on the thigh. Not with rigid discipline, just with curiosity. What happens if I don't scratch? At first, nothing. The itch pulsed once like a protest. Then it pulsed again, less convincing. The mind did the same. It offered another replay, another angle, another story. But the person stayed. Not fighting, not obeying, just staying. The dishwasher kept going. The swish-swish sound didn't speed up when the mind got loud. It didn't slow down when the body relaxed. It just continued patient and indifferent. And in that steady sound, the person felt something like permission. Maybe the goal wasn't to control the itch. Maybe the goal was to stop reacting to it like it was an emergency. The body softened another notch. The hand remained still. The mind replayed the meeting moment once more. And then for a brief second it didn't. In that brief second, the room felt bigger. Not because anything changed, but because the mind stopped tightening around one tiny point. And the person realized the itch doesn't last forever if you stop feeding it. The pause didn't last long. The thought returned, of course. It always does. Another angle, another imagined reaction from someone else, another quiet question about what it all meant. The mind was persistent, like a hand hovering just above the skin, waiting for permission to scratch again. But something had changed. The person noticed the return without the usual rush to fix it. There was a small gap now, thin but real, between the itch and the reaction. Between the thought and the belief that it had to be handled immediately. The body stayed where it was, back against the couch, feet on the floor, hands resting open. The lamp cast the same warm circle of light. The dishwasher finished its cycle with a soft click and then went silent, leaving a deeper quiet behind. In that quiet, the itch became clearer, not louder clearer. It wasn't shouting, it was asking. The mind's itch wasn't actually about the meeting, or the sentence, or the pause. Those were just the places it landed. What it really wanted was reassurance, safety, proof that nothing bad was about to happen. Scratching had always felt like the fastest way to get that proof. Think it through, analyze it, prepare for every possible outcome. That way nothing could surprise you, except surprise was still part of life. No amount of scratching had ever removed that. The person shifted slightly, feeling the fabric of the couch under their fingers. The texture was rougher than expected. A small detail, but grounding, real, present. The kind of sensation that didn't need interpretation. The itch on the wrist came back faintly like a reminder. Not strong enough to demand attention, just strong enough to be noticed. The mind mirrored it, offering another replay of the moment from earlier. This time, instead of following it, the person stayed with the feeling of wanting to follow it. There was an urge there, a pull, a tightness in the chest that said, "Do something." And underneath that urge was something even simpler: discomfort. Not danger, not failure, just discomfort. The body had learned over time to treat discomfort like a threat, to respond fast, to scratch first and ask questions later. That habit had been built carefully, layer by layer, through years of trying to cope, to be competent, to stay ahead of pain. There was no need to tear that habit down tonight. No need to fix it or replace it with something better. All that was happening was a brief experiment. What if discomfort could be felt without being corrected? The person stayed still, not frozen, just not reacting. The itch pulsed again, weaker this time. The mind replayed the thought, but the replay lacked energy. It felt thinner, like a copy of a copy. A few seconds passed. Then something subtle happened. The itch shifted. It didn't vanish all at once. It faded the way sound fades when a door closes down the hall. Gradual, almost unnoticeable unless you were paying attention. The skin still tingled, but the urgency was gone. The thought did the same. It drifted, lost its sharp edge, and loosened its grip. It didn't resolve into a lesson or a conclusion. It simply moved on. The person exhaled, surprised to realize they'd been holding their breath again. The release wasn't dramatic, just a longer breath out, like air leaving a balloon slowly instead of all at once. There was a quiet relief in that. Not the relief of certainty, but the relief of not having to do anything right now. This was the part that often got missed. Letting go wasn't about suppressing thoughts. It wasn't about forcing calm or repeating the right phrases or achieving some perfect mental state. It was about seeing the pattern clearly enough to stop feeding it. An itch doesn't heal because you explain it. It heals because you stop touching it. The same was true here. The room felt softer again. Not because it had changed, but because the mind wasn't pressing so hard against one small point. The space of attention widened. Sounds returned, the faint hum of electricity in the walls. A distant car passing, the quiet presence of the night. There would be more itches. More thoughts that demanded attention, more moments when the urge to scratch felt irresistible. This wasn't the end of overthinking, it wasn't a cure, but it was a different relationship. Instead of believing every itch needed action, the person had seen something for themselves. Some sensations settle faster when they're left alone. Some thoughts lose power when they aren't answered. The body adjusted on the couch, finding a position that felt natural. Eyelids grew heavier, not from exhaustion, but from a lack of resistance. The nervous system, no longer on high alert, began to downshift on its own. The itch was gone now. Not conquered, not defeated. Just finished. And in its absence, there is nothing special. No insight, no reward. Just a quiet, ordinary moment that didn't ask to be improved. That it turned out was enough. The stories are done. The lessons are learned. There is nothing left to do. If you found peace in this sanctuary tonight, you can return here whenever you wish. We will keep the fire lit for you. If you wish to support this channel, you may leave a gentle like or subscribe so we can find each other again in the vast ocean of the internet. But now, as we move into the final space of rest, let's plant seeds of peace deep into your subconscious. Let go, drift, and let these truths become your own. My thoughts are settling like sediment in a glass of still water. Go of all ripples. The surface of my mind is becoming glass. Like a river flows to the ocean, my worries flow away from me. Obstacles without resistance. The waters of sleep are washing over my tired eyes. Floating in a sea of tranquility, weightless and free. Breath is like the tide, flowing in and flowing out. Deep below the surface waves, my inner ocean is silent. I release the day just as a leaf drifts down a stream. Cool, healing water soothes my nervous system. Merging into the velvet depths of rest. There is no need to swim. I simply float. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. The rain of relaxation washes away the dust of the day. Clear, transparent, and still. I am clear, transparent, and still. Transparent and still. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. My emotions are water, and I allow them to flow through me. I sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. Sink deeper into the stillness of the underwater world. water fills a cup. Water fills a cup. Fills me like water fills a cup.